Hi guys, hope everybody is doing good and preparing well for the exams. This is that sort of a juncture where it's very important for us to do a quick revision of sorts. So what I've done through this video is try to bring in the overall perspective of this subject called BCK in the shortest possible time. Let's try and do the best things we can so that we have a overall grip on what this is. Since the paper is on MCQs, there is a great chance of scoring full marks and very high marks, if not for the full marks, if you can really focus on what exactly are the important parts of every topic that has been discussed. Now, you know that we have six chapters in all. Now, let me also give you an insight on how do we go about. So, for a minute, we will just read and figure out what we are supposed to do and quickly come back here. So, if I have to tell you that we have six chapters, we know that. Now, of this six chapters, our primary focus should be on chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5. Now, you know why I am not including chapters 3 and 6. Chapters 3 and 6 have a lot of content in terms of taking a toll on remembering and all that. But when it comes to the actualities of chapter 3 and 6, they are not something that you can understand going by the concept or something like that. In chapter 3, it's all about various company information. So from the Nifty 50, whatever the companies have been picked up and given there, so that's not a very encouraging topic to start off with. So we will keep that towards the end. What we will do is have a great idea of all the procedural aspects and procedural topics first. So if we can really go ahead with that piece, I think we will be able to do things very well. So is the case with sixth chapter, where a lot of one line definitions are there, which again initially if you start with that will consume a lot of time of yours. So we will keep chapters 3 and 6 towards the end as part of revision. No doubt we have to run through all the company information and go where you just have to know who the CEOs, when it is established, all of those basic details where you don't need much help of mine. Same is the case with chapter 6, which contains terminology. So we have a lot of terminology that will help you understand what various areas like marketing, stock markets, and all have to offer. We have discussed all that in the past. So exclusively one more round of reading of that will obviously make sense. But when it comes to these chapters, wherein we have basic formation of companies, understanding the forms of companies, then business environment, then of course the institutions, then how about RBI, IRDN. So this part is something that we can revise very well, and the names of CEOs, names of companies, their establishments, and of course the terminology, I think you can run through those before running to the exam. So getting back to this story here, if you can have a quick and a broad outlook of chapter 1, as you can see there, which is the business and commercial knowledge part 1, wherein you have various domains of BCK, human activities being classified into economic and non-economic activities, something that makes money, something that does not make money, something that can be done as a hobby, or something that is done for fun or recreation, right? And then the various forms of business organizations. Now, if we look at what we are supposed to do here in the overview of this particular chapter, domains of BCK. BCK as subject is very vast. We know that. Okay, let me take you through those words here. BCK is vast because it has so much content to cover by. BCK is eclectic, which means it is not about a single area or a discipline. It's about many areas and multiple areas brought together. So it is multidisciplinary. So BCK is vast, BCK is eclectic, BCK is ever evolving and expanding. So these are the three key points that one would want to remind about BCK. So they can give you four options and say which one is not related to BCK. MCQs are more about presence of mind rather than by hearting any content. So three domains to BCK. BCK is very vast, BCK is eclectic, that is multidisciplinary, BCK is ever evolving. Then the next paragraph of this particular chapter is a very procedural topic, which basically talks about what is the importance of BCK for chartered accountants. No doubt, BCK is a very important chapter because of late in CA inter and final you will have so many connected topics and terminology. So a commercial knowledge of how a business works, what a business is, in which environment it functions, all of that is no doubt very important from a perspective of a chartered accountant, right? So the chartered accountants who are generally considered as a custodian of nation's resources. So you understand how business works, the business and commercial sector, which is having a large share of their work arena. So therefore, knowing about that and what it will be useful for is a very important thing for chartered accountants. Each business will have its own sort of peculiarities and associated variations. Therefore, you need to what is raw material in one business might be the finished good for some other business. So you cannot say something being classified as raw material is raw material for everybody. So what is it? How can it be described? Who will be the right one to judge? And in this case, if you can see that, so they are saying the chartered accountant shall be able to conduct the audit diligently and take decisions, strategize, and make plans and budgets only when you are able to have a clear understanding of how the business world works. So that's a very important point when it comes to is BCK useful to chartered accountants? No doubt the answer is a yes. Then going by, so those are the two basic topics. Then going by one very easy topic from which I generally expect multiple choice questions to come is give you some activities and ask you to classify it into economic and non-economic. So once again, I would like to quickly reiterate the definitions of both. Human activities broadly are classified into economic and non-economic. Economic activities are those which eventually will get you some money, while non-economic activities are those which you do out of your interest. It may be a hobby. So, which is what is very clearly given here. Economic activities, they are a way for livelihood, and in fact, there are a variety of motives which are attributed to non-economic activities like love and affection for family, or maybe it a passion. So you're not doing that for money. Non-economic activities are driven by emotions or sentimental reasons. Why are you doing this? I like doing this. That's more a sentimental aspect, right? Non-economic activities, but economic activities are not like that, where there is a quantum of money involved. That's what economic activities are. So that's a classification there. I hope you would have gone through these. So broadly, what are the distinguishing factors? How will you distinguish between what is an economic activity and what is not? Let's see this also here. And yeah, of course, the last paragraph may be giving you a clear idea, which says, the motive and the intention behind any activity. If your motive is to make money, if your motive is commercial in nature, or where money is the prime motive, then it will be an economic activity. While if you are doing it for the sake of happiness, spreading love, affection, or a kind of passion towards doing it, where you are not really looking for money, that will be a non-economic activity. Cooking, housekeeping, etc., where you're doing it not for the sake of money. Now, we did distinguish this in the past. A chef who is cooking, who's doing it as a profession, for him it's an economic activity. For somebody else who's cooking as a hobby, for them it is not. Okay, so broadly what I was discussing is given here as the distinguishing characters. Economic activities are income generating. So whatever you do, eventually you want some money out of that. That is why you go about doing that activity. Economic activities are broadly income generating, and with which people can go up with bringing up some livelihood. More importantly, when you do an economic activity, they are productive in nature. That means finally there is something that should come out of that. If you're doing something for the sake of doing it, it won't be an economic activity again. Even consumption is an economic activity because consuming, because of which somebody is producing, then somebody has to consume, no, otherwise there is no real reason of this. So there is full supply and no demand. I know that you are also students of economics, so you know the supply demand story that even in the past that I've told you. So even consumption is the economic activity which represents the demand side of economics, because merely only supply is there and nobody is consuming it, that will be a waste product, right? So therefore consuming is also an economic activity. Because I consume only, somebody is able to produce more and more. Now, so these are all some of the points that you have to understand to distinguish between economic and non-economic activities. With these kind of economic activities, when we do work and when we do something, we generate what is called as money. Now, when you use that money for livelihood, when you use that money normally for livelihood, that is generally enough. But when you think of using that money as a matter of savings, right? For now you use it and you're saving it. Later, the same thing becomes your capital. When you are starting a new venture, the same thing turns out to be your capital. So, three words: savings, investment, and wealth. Let's just dwell that quickly. Savings, investment, wealth. So, the income that you actually, the amount that people spend to buy goods and services with the money that you earn. But after that, there is an element of savings. So if I earn 100 rupees, 40 rupees is what I want to keep it to myself, savings. With the balance 60, I am trying to meet my needs, which is what my livelihood is all about. Okay. So that is called savings. And when savings are channelized into areas like land, buildings, that is real estate, into stock markets or into mutual funds, then they turn up into investments. And when these investments are well established and you make money out of that, that will only turn into wealth. So that is the connection between savings, investment, and wealth. What once is a savings will be invested, investments will create a wealth for you. But our subject is not about economic activity or non-economic activity alone. Our subject is more on business. So doing business, is it an economic activity? Of course, business is an economic activity. There is production, there is sale, so lot of activities that help you generate money are there in business. So therefore business definitely is an economic activity. Though consumption is in the demand side of the economics, the production part of the business is the supply side of economics. So that's why it gives you the connect for both here. It's a very simple topic, lots of questions given under that. What all will form part of the demand side, supply side, and all that. So production, which is supply side, consumption, which is demand side, you link both to understand how this entire transaction happens. A basic question here: is agriculture an industry and hence a business? Now this could be an MCQ, which is why I am trying to revise that. Now you cannot obviously say a concrete answer because it says it depends. Now agriculture is a tax-free activity in India. So when you are doing agriculture, much of the agriculture is subsistence agriculture. That means you do to eat food. Moreover, agriculture under the Income Tax Act is characterized separately from any business or profession and it's exempt from tax. Therefore, if you look at really doing it, for our purpose of this definition, agriculture does not comprise any industry and therefore it is not considered to be any business. And then we have some medium enterprises. From a medium perspective, business refers to a particular type of activity or an industry, retail business, real estate business, IT business, whatever you want to call it. So where they are definitely a money making activity. So therefore, it is definitely a economic activity, right? And then moving on, uh, yeah, one more important concept in the very first chapter is how these two are distinguished. Which one? Employment and profession. I think by now all of you have a clear idea about what employment and profession is. Where profession is like people like me who are in practice, chartered accountants in practice, rendering services of specialized nature with prescribed qualifications. Chartered accountant, doctor, architecture, designing, all those are various professions. While employment, you are working under an organization on a specific job description. This is what we are expecting you to do. This is what your job role is. So it is of that sort. Employment is a contract of service, while there is a clear job description of what you are supposed to do. So the classic line of difference. Now I as a professional, I don't have any rules. I have to do business and get money, earn a livelihood. That's what I am supposed to do using my skill in the respective area. Since I studied chartered accountancy, I will render services in that area. If I studied medicine, I will be a doctor. So, profession is about using your skill in the area of your expertise which you acquired by studying. Employment is working under a contract of service, saying that I will render my services, for which you still need the qualification, but you are under a contract with some organization. They bear the risk and you do the activity based on the job description given to you. Otherwise, rest of the story is pretty simple. I think in employment you will have a fixed amount of salary, which is pretty good, while in profession you have professional receipts. When you do work, then only you will get. So professionalism is often associated with perfectionism. So professions have been engaged in pursuit of nobility, demonstrated higher level of integrity and ethics, and hence they have been held with high esteem. Not that employment is looked down or something like that, but because professionals uphold these values, not all, whoever uphold these values, they highly appreciated. A quick list of distinctions between these, if you can see. Yeah, one is a job creator, not a job seeker from the profession. Provides momentum to economic growth and development. The more we create work and the more we do things, it provides a momentum to economic growth and development. And then it is obviously, when we say it provides growth and development, the contribution is direct to the GDP. I hope all of you know what is GDP. You've already studied that, so I don't have to reiterate what is GDP. But the second point says you contribute so much to the GDP as a professional. Business persons or entrepreneur, they both are synonymous, obviously. So we, as entrepreneurs, we contribute to the nation's growth and nation building by contributing the GDP. Businesses are investment intensive. If you don't have investment, you can't do this, obviously, because these are all investment intensive. If you have lesser investments or no investment, then you can't start and stand on your own in this case. So you are not a job seeker, you are a job creator. You give jobs to the others, you contribute to the growth of the nation, investment intensive, and you are a risk taker. There is an element of uncertainty involved in it. And this word gestation means there is a waiting time, gestation period. Suddenly, today you start business, tomorrow morning you won't be successful. You have to have a basic timeline there. You have a waiting period. So, gestation and uncertainties, they are part and parcel of the story. So, patience is the key for being a businessman again here. Businesses or profession rather should be systematic, organized, and efficiency oriented activity. It's not like you get up and do something. They are what you should know, what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do, and how you are also supposed to do, right? So that's the point. With point number 5, it's objective oriented and very purposeful. Businesses, really are looking up to who you are and what you are, what are you doing, what is. Every business comes into life with certain objectives, and it has to be purposeful. You want to achieve something like that. And I mean, idealistically, if you look at it, businesses must lead the world towards a more egalitarian perspective, where an equal perspective, and think everybody is equal. So idealistically, that's what business is supposed to do, is which is an idea that corresponds to sustainable development, where everybody will be able to do some business, make sure that they have profitability and people's well-being and overall planet sustainability. Look at the broad perspective that we're thinking in. So you are happy, your house is happy, the society is happy, as a whole the planet is happy. And nobody has only one objective in business, there are multiple, which are explained as the plurality of objectives. The plurality of objectives suggests that business must not only be assessed in terms of their economic returns. Please don't weigh a business in terms of money. I told this in class so many times. Money is not the only measuring factor for determining the success of a business. If a business is doing good to the society, maybe not by making huge profits, it's still a very good thing, because you have to also, along with money, consider social and ecological returns. What good are they doing to us, right? So that's the very first part of this chapter. It's a quite an elaborate chapter. So there is a broader part of this chapter, the first two, what is BCK's introduction, and the concept of human activities, economic, non-economic, and all of that. Now the last part of this chapter deals with the forms of various business organizations. Let's just look at the various organizations and overview. I guess you're pretty comfortable with a sole proprietor because there is nothing much to really discuss in a sole proprietor. But let's just talk about a business organization. Business ownership is just about having a bundle of rights, and there are options. You can either own it singly or jointly, like in a case of partnerships and LLPs. And company, though, you know how it works. Even public can hold stake in the company. Then a joint family business, which is traditional in India in the likes of HUF. Then business may be organized as a proprietary or a corporate concern. Now, this all depends on how you want to view it and take it further. So, some of the driving characteristics, pretty easy, 4 points. Let's start with the first one, sole proprietorship. I think this is the age old form of doing business. Now, one thing to be alert with sole proprietor is there are no laws and guidelines. There is nobody who told that this is the way sole proprietorship has to operate. So there are no stringent laws. He himself is the boss, and it is the easiest and the earliest form of business. Full risk is on the sole proprietor. He is regarded as the economic hero because an individual is starting on his own, maybe providing employment to others. So no doubt he's a economic hero. Now sole proprietors, the setup can generally work on a small scale. Okay, and because we are dealing with a single individual, you can enjoy people's trust and provide certain personalized services. And its registrations are not very common in sole proprietor. Many people don't get their small businesses registered and all that, so it is still there with that little bit of uncertainty that every sole proprietor, does he get really registered? Maybe not. So a lot of unregistered sole proprietors, street vendors, they all can still be there. But a lot of people are understanding how things work right now. They may be giving importance to things like GST and all that. So therefore, they are even also looking at that. Together, this comprises of an unorganized or of informal sector. So they have a collective contribution to the GDP. Some merits and demerits of running through uh, being your own boss, but he is the sole provider of the capital, visibility of owner and personalized services. So you know who's the owner and what they're dealing with. He's the sole bearer of risk. That's a danger. And you have unlimited liability. If the sole provider dies, the entire story comes to an end. Fate of going concern. If sole provider dies, no going concern. And succession of ownership. If the sole proprietor is interested that his further generations carry on the business, then by a will or a testament, he has to appoint who are the legal heirs. Or in the will, it is written that after me, so and so person will be entitled to carry on the business. With these points only as the base, we have another form of business here called as the HUF, the Hindu Undivided Family Business, or HUF. This is HUF enjoys a special status under the Income Tax Act. It cannot be formed by any group of people. So it can be formed only by those group of people who are in the nature of a HUF, right? Uh, all the members of HUF, whoever are there, they get right to the HUF by birth. So if you are born in that family, you have a right in that entire property. The Income Tax Act considers HUF as a separate entity, but in today's time, people operating in the name of HUF have come down drastically. So a HUF cannot earn income from any salary. HUF can only conduct a business as a whole, and they can have business incomes. They can buy and sell capital assets, so they can have capital gains, or they can make money through any other sources. So all heads of income okay, but they can't have any income from salary because no single individual can work under any contract of employment to earn salary. HUF as such is a family. Okay, so it's by birth, formed by birth in a Hindu family, right? It's a family pool of resources. Both are good points, of course. It's social capital through family involvement. I'm not just looking at money. My family supports me is also a great thing here. Family members are automatically co-owners. You don't have to write any new things or will or something like that. If you're born in that family, you automatically get the right to it. That's what the act says. So again, there is no tension over there. Decision making is very quick because only few individuals are involved, so decisions can be made much faster. And also, if you're looking at the next point, unlimited liability on the Karta. You know, the Karta is the eldest male member of the HUF, and in a HUF kind of a setup, the unlimited liability on Karta sounds to be a limitation. Going concern, if somebody dies, HUF will not, like stop immediately, but few family business last beyond third generation. But in today's world, one of the points is like, people prefer to live alone, nuclear families. With that kind of an idea, uh, going concern is not great for this kind of a business. Already it has come down drastically, but HUFs are not that. Succession, automatically whoever is the eldest male member, once the Karta dies, the next eldest male member will become the Karta. So, yes, of course, there is succession by will or testament. You can anyway write it down further. So, sole proprietorship, HUF, and then we have partnership. Now, partnership is an amazing form of business. It's guided by the Partnership Act 1932. Let's look at some other features here. Partnership deed is a guiding document. It can be written and or it can be oral, but we prefer to keep it in writing. There should be an agreement, minimum of two or more number of people. Profit sharing has to be clearly decided and distinguished. Business objects are quite wider. Mutual agency, the concept of mutual agency, it can be acting as both merit and demerit. It's a very important point because sometimes it ensures all partners work together in the common interest as the mutual agency. But even if one person does wrong, it will represent everybody. That is a demerit. Partnerships have unlimited liability. If all partners die at once, then the partnership firm also will not have sustenance. Otherwise, pretty okay. Uh, and succession of ownership, it depends on whether a partner can transfer it or not. A little more evolved and better version, that is the corporate version of this concept of partnership firm, is the LLP. It's guided by the LLP Act 2008. Here there is a compulsory registration required for it. It has to be mandatorily incorporated or registered. An LLP has designated partners who will do all the work. And two things that are obviously different here are there is a mandatory incorporation and it turns out to be a separate legal entity, which is making it something better than the partnership but not as great as a company. It is a corporate body but not that great like a company, but not as bad as a partnership. So it's a very hybrid form of business organization. So that is what an LLP is all about. Limited liability is a key point. Incorporation is mandatory. That's a little procedural task. Limited liability compared to partnerships which are unlimited liability. This is amazing. And it's a legal entity separate from its partners. Minimum of two. No limit on the maximum number of partners. And register of companies, who's same for a company, is the authority. Compliances, of course, they are there. Couple of forms to be filed every year, compulsory and all that. But otherwise, it's not that very difficult to do so. Partnership has nothing, this has a little. So practically speaking, it's not very difficult, and every partner of LLP is only an agent who represents the firm. He is not the firm. And then the last kind of business entity is the company, which is the age old and traditional form of doing things. Company, so one person company has been recently introduced. Now company is a ultimate form that everybody wants to it. Two types: private company and public companies. You can see clearly given. And if you want to start a company, put up that on hold and start operations a few years later, then that will be called a dormant company, which is created and held for a future project. You think that name won't be available. You think that company may not be in the direction. So you create it now and keep it, so that will work in the uh, future. Statutory audit is compulsory. We got to prepare a couple of documents for a company called memorandum of association and articles of association. And if you are willing to go for a public issue, seek money from public, then you have to raise through a document called as a prospectus. And for all listed companies, SEBI will be the watchdog. It will be there to ensure that the prospectus contains only true and correct information. Then a quick difference between private and public to wrap up. In public, we have minimum of 7, while in private, if even if 2 people are there, it's enough. Maximum 200 people in private. There is no limit. In public, as many number of people can be the shareholders. In private companies, a restriction of share transfers. In public, there is a free tradable through stock exchange and minimum 2 directors here and minimum of 3 directors. Private companies are exempted from constituting certain boards like the audit committee, CSR committee, and all that. But public companies have to mandatorily constitute that you're taking public money. And it can start upon incorporation just like that, but here you have to get a certificate of commencement of business. It's an additional step which is not there earlier but brought in now. Okay, so with that, I guess things are pretty simple. Okay, that's the end of our very first chapter called chapter 1. I think that's a very quick revision of what we can do in the chapter 1. Now moving on, I think chapter 2 is a very straight one. So we'll go ahead with finding out what is there as part of business environment. Here, this one is a very straight and simple chapter. It talks about business environment, talking about internal, external. Then we have the macro, micro. We talk about macro factors being analyzed under pestle analysis, right? So some important points, just run through that. Let's see what are the key factors. So you know that what is the business environment according to Glueck and Josh? Every factor that is there outside. So the environment includes factors which are outside the firm. Now, outside the firm, it can create you a couple of things. Either it can turn out to be an opportunity or it could lead to be a threat to the firm. Although there are many factors, so it can either be this or this. Although there are many factors, the most important of these factors are socio-economic, technological, suppliers, competitors, and the government. So this is a, like, what do you say, the broader definition. How will this be used? You can see in your CA Inter. For now, this is what business is surrounded by: a political environment, a technological environment, a socio-cultural environment. These are all broader factors. They may not affect you daily, but they do affect you sometime or the other. But when it comes to a closer circle, we have customers, suppliers, competitors, all of them forming part in the nearer circle. Okay, so we have a very very important question that is about the 4 characteristics of business environment. And like I said, since we don't have any questions and we have MCQs, they can ask you which one is or which one is not. So business environment, if you can go by the summary there, it's very simple, complex, dynamic, that is always changing, and it's a multi-phased, which means it's based on the perception of the observer, and it's not going to talk about today or tomorrow. It's going to have a far reaching impact that is going to be in the long run. Then we have the steps that we have to take in from business environment's point of view, like finding out opportunities and threats, giving a direction for growth, and you got to always be a continuous learner. Are you a good business, bad business? How do people look at you? An image building aspect. And finally, you got to meet competition. Okay. So it's a simple set of why should you be bothered about business environment. 5 simple points. Then one question that talks about relationship between organization and environment is about the 3 exchanges that we generally do. What all do we exchange? See, by now you already know that we draw all the resources that we need from the environment, convert them into a better form, give it back to the environment. So what do we draw and what do we give it back? If you go by that logic here, so 3 points are there. You exchange information. This is not one way, all these are two-way exchange of information. That's what you take from the environment. What about you? What about the environment? What about my competitors? What are the technological developments that are taking place? Lot of information that we take, and then of course eventually we are also part of the same environment, so we give out a lot of information that we have done this, we have produced this, we are something, up to this level. So we also have a connect and an idea. Then exchange of resources, the 5 M's that you call as the resources. Where do we take them from? Environment. After using them and giving them, what did we do? We give it back to the environment again. So exchange of information, exchange of resources, and most importantly, we have an exchange of influence and power. You can't control the environment controls you. First line itself says that the external environment holds a considerable power over the organization, both by the virtue of it being more inclusive and also by the virtue of the command over its resources. So External environment literally dictates what you are supposed to do. So those are the three exchanges that we would want to understand. Then environmental influences on business. Does environment influence business? Of course, yes. Business function as a part of the broader environment. So physical, financial, all the other things that take place, right? Which are not in our control, which is what in the definition also it said. See, all environmental factors, if not totally external and beyond the control of an individual enterprise. Some of them can be managed, but some of them can't. It will environment dictate certain terms on you, so you have to do so. So if you question me on, sir, how can we have a better idea of the environment? Don't try to understand environment in full at once. That's practically not possible. So it's better that you take an initial view of it and try to understand three steps here actually. So I'll underline those for you. Take an initial view as to what is happening and what it is. So by understanding the overall perspective, what's going on, or what is the real story, take an initial view. Then we have to conduct certain audit of all the factors that are there in the environment. See, all are not going to affect you, no. Of all the factors that are there, which one is going to affect you? So that will be the second point. After taking an initial view and understanding things, the next step might be auditing those environmental influences which will impact you, right? So you don't bother about everything, you'll be bothered about only those factors that influence you. Once you know which factors influence you, you will focus more towards an exclusive consideration only on those that will have a serious impact. Otherwise, rest of the story is very simple. Now a bigger question is, why should we waste all our time doing these sort of analysis? Now definitely we are not wasting any time. There is a usage and utility of doing the environmental analysis. Nobody is an astrologer here. Everybody wants to understand what should be done in future, but none of us know any of that with any certainty. So therefore it's better and important that we understand the current situation, look at what we can do best, and then we will see what that is and where it is. It is clear that because of the difficulty to assess the future, not all future events can be anticipated. So, therefore, just at least gaze it. And before the exam, if you take care of this much, it's more than enough. Trying to understand three broad points. Why should you do an environmental analysis? If you do environmental analysis, it will provide you an understanding of current and potential changes. It will provide an understanding of current and potential changes that take place in the environment. Environmental analysis should provide inputs for strategic decision making. Tomorrow, in an organization, if you are doing what is called a strategic decision making, okay, that is at the top level of the organization, you need to know what's happening around you. So, environmental analysis will help you or provide input for strategic decision making, and it will facilitate and foster is to speed up some amount of strategic thinking. Okay, so what you are supposed to do is to open your eyes wide and do an environmental scanning. What will you scan? Four keywords: events that are taking place, which are specific occurrences. A terrorist attack is an event, an earthquake is an event, or anything like that which is significantly going to have an influence on business, that is a event. What has been happening in the past, how are things changing, that's called a trend. And what problems are we facing are called issues, and what do we ultimately want to achieve is called our expectations. You got to balance these events, trends, issues, and expectations. Then up next to the components of a business environment, you know that there is a broader circle. Now what you're seeing right here, you can have a gaze that in detail later, but I'll just take you through the major parts. We bother about the economy at large, legislation and regulation, population and demography, societal values, and of course technology. This is the outer circle. Guys, please understand, once again I'm reiterating the fact, the firm that is in center, the inner circle is internal environment, the outer circle is external environment, is wrong. Once again I'm reminding you, everything outside the firm is external environment. Suppliers, substitutes, rivals, all those are not internal. No, the inner circle is a closely external factor. while the outer circle is a broadly external factor. That is the point. We will anyway have to distinguish macro and micro factors, so you will know them better. And meanwhile, you know these four words as well: opportunity and threat. Opportunity is a favorable condition, threat is an unfavorable condition. Strength is an inherent capacity, while weakness is an inherent limitation. So this is how you need to understand and analyze these four words. And with micro and macro environment, I'll just run through the facts. You also can go through what those are. Cosmic is a shortcut that we discussed. Customer or consumer, organization, supplier, M for market, I for intermediaries, and the last C for competitors. In whatever order you write it, those are the six micro factors that are going to have a impact on you. And in the macro environment, we have demography, which is the study of population, demographic environment. Then PESTLE, I hope all of you know that: political, economic, socio-cultural, technological, legal. And then of course, going beyond the boundaries of home country is a very widely discussed concept called as globalization. So I hope you are very well aware of that as well. Globalization is going beyond the boundaries of home country. Okay. So again, yeah, that sums up the purpose here. Micro, macro environments you can run through in detail. And then we have one small topic on how will you respond to the changes that take place in the environment. Now, nobody can stop the changes in environment. It will have to go on as they are. But when you are thinking about how to react to it, we have 2 points here. Administrative responses are something that within our organization that take place. So it's more of our own changes between the vision, mission, and all that, how we are reactive to the situations in the environment, changing some people within the organization. All these are administrative responses. Only formation or clarification of organization's mission, it's more of within the organization setup. The next response that you do is a response to what competitors have done. If competitors have done something and you want to also adopt or counterattack to that, that is called a competitive response. While for all the things that we have to do with changes that take place in the environment, that is called a collective response. Cope up with problems of environmental dependence, there's always an uncertainty involved in this. So forming groups, mergers, or maybe creating a joint venture, they are called a collective response. When you can't handle something individually, you can go with this technique of doing it collectively, a collective response. Then these are the three broad categories of responses. Then holistic response from the organization's end perspective. We know these words very well. I told you so many times, you got to keep quiet sometimes. Not reacting is also reacting, right? So that is called least resistance. Then sometimes you proceed with caution. You do something, but not all at once. You'll proceed with caution, and then sometimes you end up giving a dynamic response, that is change with the change in the environment. So that's the story up there. And these are the two pretty elaborate chapters of your syllabus, right? Chapters 1 and chapter 2. And as I told you, we can for now hold chapter 3 because that's your task. You just have to run through all the basic details of a company. Well, MCQs come from that, of course. Maximum chance of one or two coming up. So just run through. It's like a 1 day task. Today you run through all those and remember and go. Tomorrow if it comes in the exam, okay. If it's not, take it easy, right? Because I told you in the class also in the past, all that information is right now available on Google. So testing somebody's memory on that, I'm not game for it. But at the same time, uh, we do have to know certain things. So likewise, if you can remember that, pretty cool. Now we will move on to chapter 4, which is again a good insight of few things. So we'll get to chapter number 4, where we are talking about government policies of business growth. Now government has to take certain measures wherein we talk about doing certain things from the perspective of the growth, not just of one entity but economy as a whole. So I would not want to dwell deeper into the stories. I will just give you a broader overview from right what you see on screen. We have the historical sketch. I hope all of you know the historical sketch that we were first ruled by kings, and then came the British, and then there was a lot of plunging of wealth. And then for a formal government to form and things starting off after 1947, we were, what do you say, the pre-independent era was very tough because, we were in a tremendous amount of exploitation. And then after that, since independence, we had 5-year plans and we did so many other things. Agriculture was the backbone of the economy, and we tried to push agriculture by doing various things. But over a period of time, we did realize that uh, like it took us almost around 44 years to realize that, if we continue to do things on our own and if we limit ourselves here, we will do a deep damage to the country again. So what we did was to open up the gates once again, but this time in a controlled manner. See, back then we didn't allow people to come in and take control, but we were a very friendly nation. Our natures are like that. We all know that. So we didn't know somebody like a British will come and exploit. We said, okay, somebody coming in here wanting to do business is okay, but exploitation was never expected. And since that happened in the past, we were reluctant to bring anything. But agriculture alone, how long can you survive, and that to a country of this size? We had persistence problem of all the problems in economics: poverty, unemployment, lack of education, all these persistent problems. The vicious circle that were there. So in 1991 they thought, okay, it is not good anymore to hold this up and keep it. I think we should go beyond this by introducing three new words to us, which are in the likes of liberalization, privatization, and globalization. LPG, the things that change the fate. As part of globalization, we allowed a few more techniques called FDI, foreign direct investments, which invert foreign direct investments, where we received foreign direct investments. Then, in the due course of time, we grew so strong that we were able to do OFDI, outward foreign direct investment, that is, Indian entities investing elsewhere. So, I think I want to just go through this chapter, but I want to skip the initial parts. I don't want to talk about that ancient India under British and all that. Just please follow this. There are things like zamindari system, what were followed: zamindari, mahalwari system. Some of you have studied that in the past. If not, then run through it. How things changed since independence. There is a story of the first 5-year plan, which was launched in 1951. These sort of key landmark things become very important. So the first 5-year plan was launched in 1951. Could be a question in the MCQ. Industrial policy 1956. So the first 5-year plan completely focused on agriculture, while we kind of moved on from there to a little industrial revolution little later, and then uh, macro policy indicators in an like in an organization. If you're looking at it from a broader perspective, what should we concentrate? But when we are talking about a country as a whole, okay, what all are the factors that you look at? GDP, inflation, tax rates, interest rates, and exchange rates. The five important. GDP is the total production that takes place in a country, the total value of goods and services produced in a country, the GDP. The rate at which things become costlier, when too much money starts chasing too few goods, that is, there is a higher demand where the requirement is higher, and money to buy that is even higher. So that leads to a technical situation called inflation, which is too much money chasing too few goods, and the prices of the existing commodities go up. If inflation is controlled, inflation should be there. It is an indicator saying that we are moving towards a better earning ability, but at the same time, too much inflation is again dangerous. So inflation is to be in a controlled manner. Tax rates, overtaxing the citizens of a country, problem. Not collecting taxes at all is also a problem. So tax rates are to be kept in a decent manner. Not altering tax rates every now and then will be giving you a stable tax structure. Then banks, financial institutions providing credit will have what is called as an interest rate. The lower the interest rates, the better for the business community, because they would like to borrow more and do more business. And of course, when cross border transactions are being processed, we also are focused on exchange rates. So five key things here: GDP, inflation, tax rates, interest rates, and exchange rates, all of which are to be discussed. And we kind of bother about each of those as a key factor. Okay, policy formulation and impact transmission process. Like in India we have different bodies doing different things, like the RBI follows, and RBI will be forming the monetary policy. Okay, is policy making important? Yes, the answer is very important. What sort of policies will be made? I want you to just get that straight here. There are various type of policies. They can give you something and ask you what is it. So be focused on this one. If something which protects the interest of customers or investors and all, they call protective policies. Consumer Protection Act is a protective policy. They want to protect somebody through that. Restrictive policies are stopping somebody from doing something. Now you know that the erstwhile MRTP Act, the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practice Act, now which is called the Competition Act. We don't want unreasonable competition or somebody becoming a monopoly, right? So some restrictive policies. Then some policies which are called as regulatory policies, like the bodies like SEBI, and then we have RBI, then we have IRDA, somebody who's a watchdog, a regulator to see what is good and what is not. So that is all the story of regulatory policies. And the last one here is a facilitative or developmental policy. So don't miss this topic. Please go through it once again. The four types of policies that are made in a economy. And I will keep this session short. I think we are already inching close to an hour, so I hope everybody has been following whatever we discussed. So I want to again reiterate the fact that you know these terminologies, so I won't again run through line by line, but I'll just give you one word, one liners rather. Relaxing all the trade rules and making it free and available for people, that's called liberalization. So removing all the restrictions and loosening it out, making things a little easy, liberalization. Allowing private individuals to hold a stake, that is called as privatization. Privatization is where government was earlier holding stake, now it's being allowed for private individuals. But there are four ways of doing this privatization which I'm more focused right now on, which is delegation. Government will still keep the power and holding, but they will only delegate the work to be done by private enterprises. This is more like a contract. So government's ownership will continue to be there, but services will be rendered by private entities, called delegation. Some stake, if they wish to sell, that is called divestment, surrenders a partial ownership. So if they want to sell the stake slowly and completely remove that entity, it's called displacement. Expands and gradually displaces the government. So government holding will gradually come down, not all at once. And portion of the ownership of stake is sold completely to a private entity, that is called disinvestment. Government is not willing to hold any investment in that anymore. Okay, so delegation, disinvestment, divestment and displacement are the four words. And you know these words. FDI, if money comes into India through a foreign entity directly, and that's been opened in a very calibrated manner here, like FDI is now allowed in almost all sectors, including insurance and all that. So some places it's 26%, some places it is 72%, some places it is 49%. Like that, in calibrated manner, it is open. But yeah, 26, 49, 51% and all that. 72% is also there now. There are some points where if you're not allowed to do it through an automatic route, then FDI is prohibited under both government route as well as automatic route. Because if you read those nine of atomic energy, lottery, gambling, chit funds, Nidhi company, agriculture, excluding those in the bracket, real estate excluding the townships and developments, transferable development rights, cigars, manufacture of any tobacco related products. No, why FDI is not allowed is because all those nine are critical areas which government wants to keep the control. India has been prominent destination for FDI. A lot of money from US, UK, Singapore, and many other destinations from where we have received money. Some people trade, they don't want to make a direct investment. So foreign entities which trade in the Indian stock markets, they buy and then they sell. They don't hold it for a long time. They call FIIs. So FDI is a direct investment into an entity, while FII is more of a trading nature. And if we make investment outside, that is called outward foreign direct investments. Indian entities have made, so a lot of Indian entities are very rich, which have made investments outside India. Not like we accepting FDI alone, that is IFDI inward. We also are making direct investments abroad, which is called OFDI. So it's a small, simple chapter, pretty cool government policies, and then we can run through just the. Okay, I think this part is very, very easy. There are two types of institutions or organizations that facilitate business. Non-funding institutions, that mean they don't give you any money, but they make policies and regulate things. While funding institutions are those, somebody like NABARD is being discussed in your syllabus, the National Agricultural Bank, which is the apex body for banking in agriculture, and under them they might advance loans to RRBs, regional rural banks, and regional rural banks will further do it. So NABARD is the only funding institution that's discussed in this chapter, but the non-funding institutions which act as regulators are RBI. You know the functions of RBI, right? RBI is the issuer of currency. I think I just want you to run through that. It's an issuer of currency, banker to the government. It's also the banker to other banks. So it's called the bankers bank. And it is a custodian for having all the forex reserves in one place. Control of credit in a country. Too much money flowing in will lead to inflation. So controlling credit, promotional functions, and collection on publication of data. So RBI even does that towards the end. So how does it help in business facilitation? I'll show this for one RBI, SEBI, IRDA. For all of them also almost on similar lines it is there. So RBI makes a currency policy with which it drives things. RBI's currency policy, how much should be held and all. Credit policy, I hope you know things like CRR, SLR, repo rate, reverse repo rate. Okay, so how much is CRR, SLR, repo and reverse repo? I wish you just want to go to the RBI site once as of when you are watching this video and take the latest rates into consideration. Okay, so there is a slighter difference between a bank rate and repo rate. Repo rate is a rate at which other banks borrow money from RBI, while if it's for a longer period, then it will be called as bank rate. So the only difference between repo rate and bank rate is repo rate is for all those loans with yeah, it's right here, 2 week duration, while bank rate is a longer period. Reverse repo rate is when I keep money with RBI, what is the interest offered by RBI? When I take loan from RBI, it will give it to me either at repo rate or bank rate, depending on the time duration that I take. And when I keep money with RBI, again I get for short term, because right now I have some surplus funds, I want to keep it with RBI. RBI gives me reverse repo rate. So what is CRR, SLR, repo rate, reverse repo rate? Just run through that. And RBI helps in developing a good financial system, helps you with fund transfers and payment mechanisms. So thanks to RBI, we are able to make NEFT, RTGS, instant money transfers and all of that. Okay, so they regulate even all of that. Then the second body that has been discussed, as I told you, is SEBI, which is a capital market regulator for all stock market transactions, IPOs, secondary market, that is stock market, all related areas. IRDA, a lot of money flows into the insurance sector, so that is exactly why IRDA is spoken about in this chapter again. And we do have Competition Commission of India, which is again a non-funding body. It doesn't give money to anybody, but it ensures that there are fair trade practices. Okay, there are some fair trade practices, and nobody is becoming a monopoly. Somebody is not dominating or killing the market is something that they ensure. And with NABARD being a funding institution, so this is more again a procedural topic. So what I want you to do is take a run through this, and if there are any points that you can see how they facilitate business and all that. Since it's MCQs, you will have 4 options, so you can easily choose, but run through all the topics once. Same is the case with chapter 6, where you can run through all the terminology. Now I would definitely not want you to waste time reading each point. I would just like to summarize one point and close here. Think of what in MCQs when we have four options, always read. Okay, always read all four options. Okay, don't jump to a conclusion. Even if A is the answer, I don't want you to simply jump to that conclusion immediately. Read the other three, be confident that A is the answer, and then go for it. So do not jump to conclusions, and because answers are in front of you, choose the right one, apply your mind, don't be hasty in making a quick answer. There is no urgency there. Of course there is a time clicking down, so spend that requisite amount of time. Don't overspend time on one bit. Don't simply just blindly mark it because you know it. So give it the requisite amount of time, and I think that will solve things. Like I said, through this revision session, I wanted to revise the other four chapters and give you a broad overview of what all those are, so that you can recollect all those topics. Spend a little more time on running through the key points, dates. Spend a little time towards the end on third and sixth chapter. Maybe you will get lucky with some year or date or terminology coming up, which will be very easy. Six chapters full of definitions. If you had heard very well in the class, you don't need anybody to revise it right now. Run through all the words once. Even if you don't find the time to read each one clearly, run through all the words, whichever words are doubtful to you. I think if you run through 10 words, you will have one word which you might really need to read the inner content. Otherwise, most of the words are something that the who are bulls, who are bears, what is a stock, all the stock market terminology. If you have heard well in the class, it shouldn't be a problem. But if you are trying to read it for the first time, then you are taking a challenge. But still, you can very well do it. Okay, so yeah, that's the quick revision that I could do for the four chapters, and request you to do it for the other two chapters, as they are very, very content oriented, which you can straight away read from the book. On that note, I wish you all the best for the exam, and make sure that you answer each bit carefully, and there is a high possibility of scoring all the marks, so make sure that you get the best of it. Thank you, guys.